Okay, so I think we're live. Great, thanks everyone who's joining. Really nice to have you, especially on such a lovely day when you could all be outside. So really glad you chose to come here instead. Great pleasure to welcome you to this event, which is called Building Back Better Towards the Green Recovery for Oxford East. I'm Karina and I'm the London Regional Coordinator for Hope for the Future, and I support constituents in the south of England and Wales to build relationships with their MPs. And that's really what Hope for the Future is all about. We're a climate communications charity and we work to equip communities and individuals to communicate about the urgency of climate change with their local politicians. And we believe that building relationships with policymakers is a really essential part of facilitating climate solutions that work for everyone. So this is our first return to running a constituency event since we had COVID-19, which changed the way that everything worked in March. And it's the first one that we've ever actually run online. So this is really exciting for us all. We'd like to thank the European Climate Foundation for funding the events project and for being really supportive in the transition to running these events online. In today's webinar, we're going to be discussing what it means to talk about a green recovery from COVID, and even more importantly, what could that look like and how can it be really truly beneficial and transformative for our communities. With the autumn statement, which is when the government will announce its next big spending plan coming up really soon, now is a crucial time to renew our climate-focused commitments and to open up a discussion about how we make those commitments a reality. And that means in this community in Oxford, but it also means across the rest of the UK. So just really quick housekeeping before we get started. Firstly, we are recording this webinar. It will be available on demand for you to watch again and to share if you'd like to. We'll send all the attendees an email this week with that link and also with other Hope for the Future resources. You can get involved today by posting questions in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of the screen. And if you see a question that you really want to see answered, please upvote it. We're more likely to see it, and my colleague Matt will be monitoring those and putting them to the panelists later on in the discussion. Please also do feel free to tag us on social media using HFTF webinar or hashtag BuildBackBetterOxford if you want to share about your experiences here today. And on the dashboard as well, you'll see a chat box. So please use that as a space to introduce yourselves and chat with other webinar attendees during the session, and ask any questions you'd like to about Hope for the Future that aren't necessarily related to the discussion directly. My colleague George is on the call too, and she will be monitoring that to answer any questions. And finally, at the end of the webinar, there will be a feedback form that should pop up in the browser. If you can take a few minutes to just fill that in, it's really helpful for us to improve our events in the future. So it would be great if you could do that. And yeah, quickly now, before I introduce our speakers, I'm going to introduce Jenny, who's an Oxford constituent, and she's been really instrumental in helping us to set up this event. And she's just going to tell us quickly why this discussion is important to her and why we're doing this event today before I introduce the speakers, and then there'll be Q&A opportunities before we finish around 2:15. So, Jenny.
Excellent. Yeah. Hi, so my name's Jenny and I'm a constituent in Oxford East, and yeah, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this event with Hope for the Future. I thought I'd just kick us off with a little backdrop on how this event came about and kind of a bit of a message of hope within a topic or industry that can be a little bit depressing sometimes. So I've personally been very passionate about climate change, and particularly the way it affects people across the world as a social justice issue ever since I was in school. But during lockdown, I had a lot of time to think and reflect, and it struck me in that time that society had really been stripped back to its bare minimum. And at first, I found that kind of scary that such change and reduction could be done so quickly. But after I thought a little longer, it also gave me a lot of hope. And what lockdown showed was that with enough pressure and when the need is really realised across the board, society and policy can change dramatically and rapidly. And furthermore, I realized that as lockdown loosened, we'd be rebuilding a society slowly that was expected to be different. And a society with the future health of our planet and the people on it really at the center. Which is why I contacted Hope for the Future and Annalise as well, and we put on this event to bring together policymakers, industry experts and like-minded constituents in Oxford to really build on that hope and this incredible opportunity that COVID has really provided us with to discuss and highlight the importance of green recovery and what more we can be doing. So I'll hand back over to Karina.
Thanks, Jenny. Yeah, I think that's a really great introduction to why this is so important to you and to the community. And yeah, so to discuss that on our panel today, I'd like to introduce, we have Professor Cameron Hepburn, who's the director of the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment at Oxford University and a leading environmental economist. We also have Charlie Hicks, who is an Oxford local and an Oxford student, who's part of the local Build Back Better Oxford campaign hub. And we have Annalise Dodds, who's the MP for Oxford East, and also the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer. And we'll hear first from those three speakers and engage in a Q&A with them around the priorities for a green recovery in Oxford. And then we'll hear from our final two speakers who will speak on how we can engage with communities and policymakers at multiple levels in order to implement those priorities. And so joining us for that section, we will have Dr. Anna Bullen, who manages the Innovation Lab, which is part of the newly established Zero Carbon Britain Hub at the Centre for Alternative Technology. And we also have Simran Bakra, who serves as the UK manager for CDP's Cities, States and Regions team. So a really fantastic panel, really big welcome to each of you, and thank you all so much for joining us for that discussion today. And as I said, we're looking at what a green recovery from COVID will look like, and in particular what that looks like in Oxford. That's a lot to get through in an hour and 15, but we'll do our best to cover as much as we can and ask all of the questions that you want answering. And with that in mind, I'm going to hand straight over to Cameron to begin, kick off our discussion today.
Thanks, Karina. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm happy to join you here today. As Jenny said, I also tend to be someone who looks at the glass as being half full all the time. And when COVID happened, without diminishing the damage and the challenges that it's created, it also is a moment in which from which we can build back better. And at the University of Oxford, we pulled together a team of people jointly with Nick Stern at the LSE, Joe Stiglitz at Columbia, and Dimitri Zengelis at Cambridge, to try to work out precisely what that would look like at a very high global level. So I'm not the expert on Oxford East here. I'm sure Charlie and Anne and Annalise will say more there, but at a very abstract and slightly more theoretical, or at least more empirically based level, what we did was look through recovery policies over the last decade and a bit, and we collated several hundred different policies used by countries all around the world. We condensed them into 25 policy archetypes, and then we asked ourselves which of those policies to build back better would be able to do everything, do the climate, do the economy. And the reason for this is, in my experience doing environmental economics, working in the area, is that the policy focus, what comes first is always security, whether it's military security or national security. Second is economic issues, and the environment sadly often comes third. But it doesn't come third if it affects one of those top two priorities. And in this context, it's no surprise that a fundamental focus of every government around the world, whether it's, the Americans have millions of unemployed, the Indians, I think we're over 20 or 30 million unemployed, and in the UK as well, it's going to be about jobs. And in Oxford East too, it will be about jobs. And so our exam question for ourselves was, how do you best create jobs coming out of this recovery? And ideally jobs that would generate economic assets that are useful for the future. And the hopeful message from our study, when we looked at these 25 policy archetypes and when we surveyed 231 officials from treasuries and central banks around the world, is that the policies that create jobs and deliver you long-run valuable economic assets are not necessarily at odds with the sorts of policies that you'd want to see to get us towards net zero. And in fact, I say not necessarily. The alignment was far stronger than I expected, and than I think many people expected. And what I'd like to do, just very briefly, is give you a flavor of those results, which hopefully you can see here up on your screens. This chart shows you the long-run economic multiplier on the horizontal level. What this basically means is this good for the economy? So a pound spent by the UK Treasury in this particular area, how many pounds does it bring in overall increases in national income? That's the idea of an economic multiplier. And then you can have a look at the climate impact as well, assessed here subjectively by these officials, but as being highly positive or highly negative. And then we're also giving you an indication of the overall desirability of the policy in terms of its color, of size of the bubble, and the speed in terms of the color there. And I'd highlight that obviously things like policy M here, which is really properly supporting your healthcare system, strongly favored by experts around the world, not that surprising. It's labor intensive, very valuable in an era of a pandemic. So that comes out as being highly advantageous, but also things like S here, making sure that we can connect with each other in clean ways, broadband, etc. And T, policy T, which is clean energy infrastructure. Obviously great for the climate if you're building out the energy storage, the renewables, wind and solar, the EV charging points, the bike lanes, etc. That all makes great sense from a climate point of view, but it also makes sense from an economic point of view because you're creating quite a lot of jobs and you deliver overall economic benefits to the economy. Similarly, spending in richer economies, this wasn't a result that came out of sub-Saharan Africa or poor countries, but spending on clean research and development comes out very strongly as delivering long-run benefits to both climate and the economy, as does retraining workers, so that what you've got are the skills and the capabilities that are fit for purpose in a world that is moving towards net zero emissions rather than in the fossil industries of yesterday, because those industries are insecure. They're insecure on the capital side. We know a lot of the assets are going to be stranded, but they're insecure jobs as well, because as the capital is stranded, the labor is stranded as well. So if you've got a lot of unemployed people, it's an ideal time to reskill them because they're not facing large opportunity costs of being productively employed. They're sitting at home, so get onto Zoom or Teams or something else and build a set of skills that's useful for the future. Two other ones just to highlight here, U and V. Now, depending on the country, we got different responses here, but the message I'd like you to take home, in terms of the natural infrastructure of a country, including the UK, this is something that we know can deliver very big economic benefits by providing natural flood resilience, especially a place like Oxford, where we're used to a bit of flooding, and actually management of that flooding can be achieved by understanding the upstream ecosystems. Our head of social sciences here, Professor Dame Sarah Watmore, has done pioneering research in this area, but this is true around the world. If you design your natural infrastructure better, then you're delivering economic benefits in the long run. And as it happens, this is often something that can be done very safely in a socially distant way, and we need skills, development of skills to do it really well, but actually you can get large numbers of people doing this very quickly. So they can go from pulling pints to planting pines or other sorts of plants. And then buildings upgrades in a country like the UK and in a constituency like Oxford East, we're still not all living in beautifully insulated passive homes. and there's an awful lot of economically valuable investment that is job creating that can happen there. So we put this study out. We emphasize the three key findings as being these three, that you can do both together, climate and the economy. If you do those, you get significant other benefits as well to health, and actually political benefits, dare I say. Country after country, we've seen that this is popular now in a way that it isn't always popular to be addressing climate. It's now very, very strongly popular in many countries. But we also look through the literature of the last decade or so, and you can get this wrong by putting in place the right kind of idea, but the wrong detail of the policy. So for instance, without critiquing any particular government, if you design a scheme that subsidizes a certain activity from a particular date, then before that date, people may stop the activity because they don't want to do it in a way that means that they can't get the subsidy. So just getting the design of particular policies is really important. But let me end there just to say in closing that I've been stunned by just how excited the world has been by this single paper. Its media reach has been over 1 billion. I've had the Minister of Finance of France having a phone call and tweeting it with us, and country governments across North and South America, across Africa, the development banks, all wanting more. So I think there's an appetite for building back better that goes well beyond Oxford East and beyond the UK to the global level, but it's important that we get it right at home as well. So thanks for the invitation.
Wow, yeah, thank you so much. It's really great to hear how well received that research has been, and getting such a global overview of how that could look. And from that global bird's eye view, we're going to go right into a hyper local view, and we're going to hear from Charlie about what kind of vision there might be for Oxford and the community that you have there.
Amazing, thank you, Karina. Thank you for having me as well. Thanks for the invite. Can everyone see my screen okay? Fantastic. So what I'm going to be talking about today is the Better Oxford campaign. It's what we've been doing over the last couple of months for building back better in Oxford. So first off, I'm a volunteer from the Build Back Better Green New Deal local hub. It's a national campaign with local hubs applying the principles of a Green New Deal to building back better. And that boils down to climate justice equals social justice equals climate justice, and we're applying that at the local level. So for us, the particular issue that we've been focusing on is congestion in Oxford, and we'll go into why that's important. I'll talk about what's happened so far over the last couple of months, campaigning, listening and talking with the public, and then what's next, proposals for Oxford East. So what's the issue? Congestion in Oxford. All these pictures have been taken in the last week or two, and it shows absolute gridlock in central Oxford. But there is another way. On the left is Brighton, on the right is London. It is possible to cut congestion and redesign spaces for people, which is better for the economy, better for health, better for livability, better for the climate, so many things it's better for. This is a climate issue. This is from this year, June 18th, over 30 degrees within the Arctic Circle. It's happened multiple times. We're in a climate crisis. And we know that surface transport, so cars and other motor vehicles, provide the biggest CO2 output of any industry in the country. So this is a big climate issue that we have to tackle. It's also a public health issue. Now, I find people outside of the medical world don't really, this term public health doesn't really resonate with people, so I prefer this term human health. This affects all of our health as humans. So this picture on the left is illegal levels of air pollution in Oxford East, that's St Clement's, and we know that poor air pollution exacerbates the spread and severity of COVID, as well as heart attacks, cancers, strokes, etc. So there's a big human health element here to focus on. Taking the words of Michael Marmot, there can be no more important task than to reduce health inequalities. And I think health inequalities is perhaps the #1 metric of success of a society. So let's take a look at what that's like in Oxford. This is a map of illness, the burden of illness across Oxford. The darker areas have higher levels of long-term illness. And if we map onto their Oxford East, we can see that there's high levels of health inequality in Oxford East, especially if you compare it to the northwest of Oxford. This is a picture of the COVID deaths in Oxford East, and it's the same thing. It's not a happy picture for Oxford East in regard to health, illness, and COVID deaths. Oxfordshire is one of the most affluent areas of the country, but this hides the astonishing fact that there are 10 wards in Oxfordshire which feature areas which are in the 20% most deprived in England. Of those 10 areas, 6 of them are in Oxford East: Northfield Brook, Rosehill and Iffley, Blackbird Leys, Carfax, Barton and Sandhills, and Littlemore. So public health inequalities is a big issue for Oxford East. So what can we do about it? Actually, sorry, this is the one that really hits home for me. The life expectancy gap for men living in Carfax to the least deprived wards in Oxfordshire is 15 years. There's a 15-year life gap between someone living in Carfax in Oxford East to the most affluent areas of the county. So this is shockingly awful statistics on health inequalities. So what can we do about it? Illness is just the tip of the iceberg, and actually we've got to drill down to the bottom to look at social, community and living environment. So health behaviours, socioeconomic factors, the built environment and healthcare. And that's why we focus on congestion. It stops us living healthily, it stops us travelling healthily, it entrenches inequalities, it is the built environment, and it reduces our access to healthcare. So that's why we're focusing on this issue. So we've been campaigning, listening with people, talking with the public. We as a campaign organisation teamed up with a series of other transport groups. These are the real experts locally. And we put together a pop-up shop, an exhibition where we put forward plans to ask the public, is this any good? And this is some of the stuff we showed them. So top left there is what Broad Street could look like if it was pedestrianised. We've got school streets on the top right, different levels of pedestrianisation, segregated cycle lanes that really make cycling easy, attractive, social. And we asked people, what do you think? So we videoed them. We just went out and chatted to as many people as we could to get as many views as possible. And we tried to get, across the spectrum of society. And this is what they said. I'd like to be able to cycle with my children in Oxford without worrying about cars and trucks. The up, down of pavements is so exhausting. If there were no cars and I could ride on the road, it would be wonderful. That's Sarah, a wheelchair user. This Chris here, the guy that founded Pedal and Post, a great delivery company that uses bicycles. We've just invested 45,000 in new equipment and created 5 new jobs. So we're talking about new job creation. This is where it's happening. By doing this in the long run, we are making the future better for our grandchildren. I work in Oxford. I'd like to see the centre become car free. We have to focus on cycling areas for the Abingdon and Botley roads because they're so busy. From a Deliveroo driver. Here, Julie, a mum to be, it's nice to just relax and sit. A business owner on St Michael Street has just been pedestrianised. It's given our business a huge boost and increased business triple-fold. I like cycling because it's less stinky than a car and you get way more fresh air there from a 7-year-old. We also collected lots of written feedback from the public and collated that together to write a report for Oxfordshire County Council. We encourage people to complete a survey about cutting congestion with bus gates, and it saw 7,000 responses, where usually a survey like this would get about 1,000. So that was really, really good public engagement. And there has been tangible progress. So Oxford City Council has done some great work to pedestrianise George Street and also St Michael Street, which has seen a real boost for people coming together, for community, for cutting air pollution and for local business. So what next? Well, there's some really exciting proposals for Oxford East that have been put in. I just want to focus again on what really matters here. So healthy behaviours, socioeconomic factors, the built environment and healthcare. And this is what's been put forward by the County Council. So it's a bit of a messy map, but basically what it's proposing is to really change the built environment for Oxford East and South Oxford, primarily to help better access to the centre and to the hospitals at East Oxford from South Oxford. So what it's putting forward is healthier travel, that's our healthy behaviours, access to hospitals, that's the healthcare access, reducing inequalities, that's the socioeconomic factors, and it's all being done by changing the built environment. So it is the bottom of our iceberg here for reducing health inequalities. And so the question now is, please get involved. This is a public movement. We want to get as many people involved as possible, whether it's social media is your thing, creating digital content, journalism, talking to people, politics, whether you're well connected with a social justice and climate justice slant. We want to build as big a public movement at the local level as possible to get this done. And if you're interested, then please email us at oxfordgreennewdeal@gmail.com or follow us on Twitter at oxbackbetter. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Charlie. Oh, I don't know about you guys, but it's great to hear like so much positivity from both of the speakers we've had so far. I mean, it definitely seems to me like there is a way forward, and I'd love for that to continue when we hear from Annalise now as well. So.
Well, thanks very much indeed for enabling me to be a part of this discussion, and I certainly will combine optimism in terms of what we can achieve, but maybe a little bit of a dose of extreme urgency as well, just to kick off with that, because you know, I don't actually personally use the term climate change anymore, because for a lot of people that makes it sound like some kind of you know, kind of long-term trend. Actually, we've seen, of course, over the last couple of years, including in Oxford, record temperatures. We're now seeing extreme stress on much of our infrastructure. You know, people remember some of the flooding that's occurred across different parts of the country just in the last few weeks. You know, railway lines being washed away. This is not normal. It is a crisis. We need to see very urgent action. I do agree with what the other speakers have said about the fact that this is a time when many policymakers' views perhaps about the potential for that action is starting to change. And I, for one, I'm very, very much enthused and encouraged by that. But we have got to be cognizant of the fact that we are, of course, well behind where we need to be. I mean, we have this net zero commitment set into UK policy of 2050. Even to hit that, we are too far behind, right? So we do need to speed up. So I'm going to talk really quickly about local issues and then national ones. Locally, I very strongly agree with what Charlie set out. You know, I've consistently been a supporter of Connecting Oxford, which is the umbrella term for that system of bus gates. Now, the term bus gate sounds kind of very benign, but actually what it means is that people who want to use their car to get between different bits of Oxford are going to have to take a different route in the future. They are going to potentially have to take a route in some cases that's going to take a bit longer. But I think in the city, very effectively, NGOs like Charlie's one, you know, different groups of local residents, councillors and others, they've been working together to set out the case for this change. We need to do it for health reasons, for climate reasons as well. And I personally have been really encouraged by the fact that there's been relatively little pushback on this. Now, you know, there are a handful of cases where you know, it is going to be difficult for some businesses. I think, you know, the councils are trying to work with them to help them around that. But it's something that we need to do. We need to keep that strong support there. So anything people can do to help with that, you know, whether it's the comments pages of the Oxford Mail or online, or you know, discussions on BBC Oxford, whatever it is, let's make it clear that this is something that people want. I would say that's the case also for other low carbon interventions. Kylie Branch Line only operates for freight. You know, last 3 years I've been saying, please, can we get this open to passengers? You know, it's something that should have happened a long, long time ago. If we did that, again, it'd be ticking both the environmental and social justice boxes very clearly. And I agree with what was said about pedestrianisation as well. You know, I remember the days when people jumped up and down and said that Cornmarket couldn't be pedestrianised. We can barely imagine it in its old state, its old polluted state. And I think here, all that we can do, you know, it's really interesting to see that quote from a local business, all that we can do to say this is something that actually helps local businesses, because people are more likely to just nip into a shop, they're more likely to spend time on those genuinely livable streets when they're not worried about their kids being run over, when they're not worried that they're going to be hit by a car or breathing in pollution constantly. So let's keep up the pressure. Let's try and get it going across Oxfordshire as well, because it needs to happen right across the county, but of course we need it across the country too. So really quickly, I'm very conscious of time here, but just on a few of the national issues, particularly from my role as Shadow Chancellor, you know, I really strongly agree with what Cameron was saying about employment and green jobs and environmentally friendly jobs. I think his report and his group's report was really helpful in that regard. I suppose this relates to some of the challenges around this agenda. You know, I think very often people think that a green job, for example, would not be something for them. You know, they think it's something for other people. Actually, there are so many different areas where I would argue, personally, the UK is lagging behind, where there's a lot of employment potential, where we can quite quickly get people back into work, you know, particularly those who are becoming unemployed. which is good for them and it's good for those who then benefit from those services. I mean, obviously around insulation, energy efficiency, biodiversity protection, etc. My party's been strongly focusing for support for employment in those areas. We've seen some moves in that direction with the Green Jobs Fund in the UK, but really quite relatively limited. We'd like to see much more action in that area. Secondly, because we're so far behind the net zero target, just having that target on its own clearly isn't driving the change that's needed across policy. So I said to the Chancellor, and I'll continue to say this, that every investment decision that's taken must be contributing to that net zero goal. So we need to make that explicit within all of those policy areas. We need them to be properly tested and we need that to be actually published, needs to be hardwired into Treasury decision making. We then also, of course, need to have just a bigger quantum of investment in those critical technologies that are important for the green transition. If you bundle together all of the environmentally friendly measures in the investment package that was first presented by the Prime Minister just before the summer break, they only amount to just about what Germany's spending just on hydrogen. So much, much smaller commitment. Now that's bad for the environment. It's also bad for jobs in our country. It's bad for our economic future. So we need to have that, that focus. We need to, of course, protect biodiversity as well. May end up talking about the agriculture bill potentially. You know, real lack of clarity there about what's going on. We've got a real tragedy around biodiversity, soil quality, etc., as well as around the climate. But then finally, we also do need to have more intervention on a number of areas where we just don't have that coordination yet. You know, we've seen a lot of change, real mess around a number of renewable technologies, onshore wind, you know, where we've had a hostile environment, charging infrastructure for electric vehicles, you know, still a whole plethora of different approaches. We do actually need to have a grip taken of these issues by central government. So yeah, I want to stop there and already feel like I've gone on too long, sorry, but looking forward to the questions. I would say for any of my constituents also on the call, if there's anything you don't have the chance to ask now or that you want to raise with me, please always get in contact with me. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Annalise. And yeah, absolutely would love it if there was more of a dialogue between the constituents and yourselves and all of the community initiatives that are happening in Oxford. So that's really great that you're open to that. Now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Matt, who has the unenviable task of deciding which fantastic questions he should be putting to you, to all of you. So that's on to you now, Matt.
Thanks, Karina. And just to note that we're going to come to Anna and Simran after this Q&A, just in terms of getting through this Q&A and then getting to our last two speakers. So we'll go to one of the ones in the Q&A. Julie asks, to Annalise Dodds, will you be supporting the upcoming climate change bill, by which I believe she's probably getting at the Extinction Rebellion ecological and climate emergency bill that is going to be pushed through the protests in the next weeks. Is that something the Labour Party are engaging with at the moment?
Well, maybe further details about the contents of that bill can be provided to me, because I don't have them in front of me, I'm afraid. I mean, I've had a lot of discussion with ER locally and nationally as well. So, I mean, assuming it's along similar lines of what's been pushed before around the target and trying to bring that forward, around having more consistent action on climate issues, and in fact, related to one of the other questions, really hardwiring that into decision-making processes so that it's not just a rhetorical thing, but it's actually put into practice. You know, that is something that I've traditionally supported. But I would really want to see, I'd really want to see a bill right in front of me. But certainly when I've had discussions with ER before, as I've said, you know, I think there's a lot of commonality there. And I do genuinely think, and I've said this in the House and in House of Commons and elsewhere, that I think Extinction Rebellion should be praised for the pressure that they've managed to exert on government to get them to, you know, at least initially admit that there was a climate emergency. But of course, now we need to do much more.
Bill, thank you very much. Charlie, returning to you, what Logan's asking in the questions about the autumn statement coming up. and clearly there's a huge amount of kind of money to be spent in investments and to re-stimulate the economy. What are the kind of concrete things that your group would be looking for in the autumn statement from central government?
So the main demands of the Build Back Better and Green New Deal campaign, to sort of bring it back to the principles really of the Green New Deal. So there's 5 principles. One is that we need solutions to the climate crisis. Second, around solutions to the ecological crisis. And actually we've got to remember it's not just the climate, but it's also ecological breakdown, soil, biodiversity, etc. We need economic transformation, a way that takes the levers of sort of monetary power away from private finance and back into something that's democratically backed, and something which creates millions of new jobs, new green jobs that can take us out of the climate crisis in a way that will also take us out of the financial crisis, which is upcoming. And through all of that, we need a sense of social justice and also global justice, understanding that the effects of the climate crisis are going to affect those in Africa and South America more than they are us in Europe, and we have to take a global view to what is a global problem. And so, however, those principles are then applied into the autumn statement around green investment for green jobs.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Turning to Cameron, on the issue of jobs, Sarah's, I mean, this is addressed to Annalise in the comments, but it'd be interesting to get your take on it. Clearly, one of the trickier issues is the aviation industry, where there are a lot of jobs that might be unionised jobs as well and relatively well paying, but clearly, if we're going to meet climate change targets, it's not particularly sustainable to be bailing out the airline industry. I know that was something that was on your chart. How are policymakers responding to you on the question of aviation?
Yeah, so aviation bailouts were on our survey, and it was surprising to me just how badly they came out. I mean, it's almost worth me putting it back up again, which I'll try and do. But then this is unconditional aviation bailout. So for what it's worth, my view is that a conditional aviation bailout is fine, which is to say, there's an awful lot of jobs, an awful lot of economic value created by the aviation industry. Happily, many of us are learning that you can get a lot of that value by staring down a camera lens, but you can't get all of it. I'm Australian, for instance, and so my carbon footprint is probably pretty big compared to many of yours, which I take no joy. But the aviation industry allows me to connect with my family. And so the key is the conditions. And you've seen rather different responses from one government to another. Some have got the recovery really right, but then they've bailed out their aviation industry with no conditions. And my sense is that it's entirely feasible for the aviation industry to be net zero. And it has to be, apart from anything else, so it's going to be. It's not easy. Nobody says it's easy, but these things always seem hard until you start trying. And then once you start trying, you realize, oh, actually, yeah, we can do that. We could try this. We could do ammonia in planes. We hadn't thought of that, but actually that could work. It's energy dense. It's be produced from wind and solar, and so on and so forth. You can electrify short haul flights. You can do this. You can do that. So I think what's required is the clarity of the commitment, well beyond CORSIA, which is the current commitment, just that they're going to have carbon neutral growth by offsets. Not good enough. We need net zero, and we need tech change. We need to get the planes into action and the technology happening now. So that's my view for what it's worth. And as Annalise perhaps is answering, I'll pull up the slide at the end.
Thanks, Cameron. Yeah, just turning to you, Annalise. So Sarah's specific question was, most Labour MPs voted for Heathrow expansion not very long ago. Post-COVID, what is your view on the industry?
Yeah, I mean, I voted against expansion, and I don't think that we should be seeing expansion of airports. I mean, I very strongly agree, actually, with what Cameron said, and myself and my party, obviously I've been working closely with Ed Miliband, who's the Shadow Business Secretary on this. We have said, look, there's got to be change, very, very significant change in both aviation and aerospace as well, so the industry that creates the planes that are then used in aviation. we need there to be significant change. Because of the climate crisis, there's also going to be a structural reduction in demand following this, because there will be less business travel. That is going to be the reality. But the problem currently is you have very destructive change, you know, huge numbers of jobs being lost, quite a number of them actually in the kinds of engineering fields that we really are going to need for the just transition. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was in North Wales with some of those involved with a project on the wings of the future. You know, unless you really improve the energy efficiency of that technology, yes, with a reduction in air travel use, but unless you do that, you're not going to be able to drive down emissions. But yet they're expecting that they could have very, very significant, well, they've already had quite significant job losses already. So we need to acknowledge that there's going to have to be change, but we need to ensure that change is not destructive change. So that's my view on that industry.
Just briefly, for what it's worth, aviation bailouts are policy E, voted the worst, effectively, or viewed as being the worst among 231 officials from finance ministries and central banks on economic and climate impact. So I was surprised about how badly they were rated on the economic dimension, but frankly, and we did a bit of bias analysis just to check that this wasn't some kind of weird result, but it's not. So there you go.
That's really interesting, thank you. And Charlie, sticking on the issue of travel, I suppose, we had a question pre-submitted through the Eventbrite asking, given so many people manage to reduce commutes and work from home, it's asking, can we look at repurposing offices into flats instead of building on the green belt? Maybe it's time to think how we work and use our buildings. So given that, I mean, do you think there's opportunities for how we kind of design our cities and how we commute and how we transport? What are the opportunities for how we kind of reshape where we work and commute coming out of this?
Totally. I think it's a really, really exciting opportunity. If you just start from a blank slate and take a very high level view, we've got buildings, we've got lots of buildings, and I think we're going to see that people aren't going to go back to work. I look to the tech companies, and Google has basically said to their employees, you don't need to come back until next summer, like of next year. And so I think lots and lots of companies are not going to be sending their people back into offices. So there's sort of two areas here. There's the building space, and we know there's a massive housing crisis. We also know that there's way better things you can use buildings for in terms of bringing communities together and tackling the loneliness crisis and other social care, etc. So there's lots that can be done there. And there's also around commuting and transport. So if people need to travel less and we can change the ways that people travel, then you can also then redesign the public realm. So for example, if we can move people out of their cars, which are very space inefficient, they take up lots and lots of space, whether they're moving or parked, and you redesign those spaces for cycling, walking, and taking the bus, then you get back so much space, which you can then put to some amazing, amazing things in your city. And I think that's the real key to unlock better cities, is to think about those two areas. What are we going to do with this building space, and how can we reutilize the public space in terms of how we transport, how we get around to really build community in a way that also solves for the climate crisis.
Thanks, Charlie. Annalise, could we bring you in on this? Obviously, Oxford has very high housing prices and office costs. So are we going to see a shift in the way that people work and travel and commute?
Yeah, I mean, I think we will see a significant shift, but I suppose my concern is that it needs to be a managed and planned change, again, rather than one which will naturally occur because of what's occurring around coronavirus, etc. Because, I mean, we've seen quite a lot of change around the regulatory context for turning offices into homes, for example. Quite often what's happened, unfortunately, is that pretty poor quality offices end up being turned into extremely poor quality, tiny little rabbit hutches, which are nowhere for, I mean, I wouldn't want to bring my kids up in them. So, you know, I don't want any of my constituents to be in that situation either. So I think we need to think about this, given that a large part of the population aren't able to work from home anyway, and it tends to be the most low paid people. So, you know, how are we going to make sure that they still have a decent quality of life but B, that change can be a planned change. I mean, I agree with Charlie about the potential. I mean, you can imagine really livable streets where, you know, the street is almost an extension of everyone's front garden, you know, where people aren't frightened about being knocked over, but there can be so much positive to come out of it. But we need to make sure that that process does have some local management, which is accountable within a national framework, I suppose.
Thanks. Just turning to Cameron, we had another pre-submitted question of how can polluting industries that generate jobs be dismantled? How can we avoid political capture by the economic elite in decisions?
Is that on me?
Sorry, if we put that to you, Cameron. Sorry, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, that's a rather big question. How do we avoid capture? I mean, I think the well, it's key with all of these big transformations to understand the forces of change and the forces of resistance. We actually have a paper that I'm very excited about, one of my doctoral students does, coming out, trying to really understand the dynamics of change here from a deeply theoretical and empirical perspective so that you can then apply it to the climate context. But I guess what that paper leads us to is to the awareness that actually civil society has a hugely important function here in making sure that the majority isn't a silent majority, or at least a quiet majority. And we know from Manker Olson onwards that if you have concentrated interests that are affected by change and diffuse beneficiaries, the beneficiaries often don't say anything, and those who are damaged by the change, even if the change is positive, will get together and block it. And I think that's been true across a number of big public issues, whether it's tobacco and public health. It's true in climate as well, and it's true right now. And the challenge, going back to something Annalise said right at the start, which is absolutely right, is that this is very urgent, and the inertia goes the wrong way. You know, if you're building back better, if you need to build back, the simplest thing to do is more of the same. And despite the interest in our work, the conversations I've had since with all the development banks, with the IMF, with the World Bank, with the Chinese government, with multiple governments, it's the case that the straightforward thing to do is to do more of what you know. And more of what we know is fossil intensive and emitting. And we've already built the capital stock that will take us to 2 degrees. So, you know, we can't afford to be building more fossil capital stock, but that's what we will do if we can't overcome this resistance. So whether it's Extinction Rebellion, groups like this one, I mean, the requirement of people around the world not just to think, well, I'm only one voice, so I won't bother. That way, destruction lies. Actually, everybody needs to step up at this moment. And it's particularly important right now because if the money isn't spent in a way that transitions us, it will be spent pushing us over the edge. You know, there's not kind of that many shades of grey here anymore. It's a one-off moment. I haven't worked as many post 2 a.m.s as I have in the last 4 months for years, probably since I was a McKinsey consultant, frankly. And that's because this particular moment is just so pivotal. So yeah, a big thumbs up to what you're doing, but also to everybody who can move the needle, even if it's in a tiny way.
Thank you very much. And that's the time for our first Q&A. We will have another Q&A later on after the next 2 speakers, Anna and Simran. So do get your questions in for that. But I think Annalise might be having to leave us for 2. So I don't know if there's anything you quickly want to say, Annalise, while we've still got you, just in conclusion.
No, I think just want to thank you all for everything that you're doing, really, and the voice that you are putting out there in favour of the environment. And, you know, it's so interesting that Cameron mentioned Olson's theory here. I mean, he's absolutely spot on that, and we're seeing it in Oxford. We're seeing, you know, kind of quite small groups of people, often not those actually who'd be directly affected, but who are arguing against change. I think where we can show that there's a collective voice that really does need that change. It's incredibly helpful. So yeah, all power to your elbows, really, and thanks for organising this event.
Thanks. Great, so I'll pass back to Karina, and we've still got Anna and Simran to come. So keep your questions coming in, and we'll try and read them out for the next Q&A.
Yeah, thank you all so much for engaging with all of those questions, and thank you for joining us, Annalise. Do head off whenever you need to. Yeah, so it's really great. We've been looking at what kind of policies we need on like a huge scale and what kind of policies you might want in your communities. And we're going to move on to talk about how you could potentially implement them, how you engage communities in those decisions, and how you engage policymakers in those decisions with Anna and with Simran. So I'm going to firstly hand over to Anna to talk to that.
Thanks, Karina. Yeah, likewise, first of all, I'd like to say thank you for inviting me to take part. It's a real pleasure to be joining you. I'm not based in Oxford, I'm based in mid Wales, but I'm very fond of Oxford personally, and I also often cite it as an example of good practice. The fact that Oxford was the first city in the UK to run a climate assembly is really pretty awe-inspiring from my perspective, given someone who is all about kind of engaging participants and stakeholders, which is what I'm going to talk to you about a little bit now. As Karina said earlier, I'm based at the Centre for Alternative Technology in mid Wales, where over the last 13 years, we've been building an endpoint scenario for a zero carbon Britain based on very complex hourly modelling. And through that research, essentially we know we have the technology. We've already got the technology we need to reach net zero, but there are still key barriers. And those key barriers that need to be overcome are political, they are cultural, they're economic, and they're psychological. And it's overcoming those barriers that's needed in order to lead to the systemic change that is needed to face the climate crisis. And I'm sure I don't need to tell any of you that the climate crisis is an incredibly complex problem, the implications of which affect everyone, albeit to different degrees. And the journey to net zero has just been made even more complicated and challenging by the current COVID-19 pandemic, which governments, councils, communities all around the world are still grappling with, whilst also attempting to develop effective recovery plans, which hopefully, as with Oxford, will still address the climate emergency that we face. So thinking about the complexity of the problem, problems such as this include multiple stakeholders. Often those stakeholders have intertwining or contradictory interests. And these problems are often then referred to as wicked problems. While they present multiple possible approaches, there's no obvious single root cause or solution. In other words, wicked problems such as the climate crisis are everyone's problems. There are no single person's responsibility or state's responsibility or government's responsibility even, and they require multiple stakeholders to address them effectively. And because of the nature of this and the nature of the barriers that we face, which I mentioned previously, it's my belief that co-creation or co-creative practices offer a viable tool, both to unlock those solutions and then to implement them. And just very quickly to clarify, I'm going to refer to stakeholders quite a lot over the next few minutes. What I mean by a stakeholder in this context is any individual or organisation with an interest in and or an influence on the issue that we're discussing, be that climate change itself or the green recovery. So very, very quickly, what is co-creation? Co-creation is a form of open participatory policy or strategy development, where those implicated by the outcomes are directly involved in its creation. So it draws on a range of perspectives of key stakeholders in order to inform the process and ultimately the design in order to create an effective product, for want of a better word, in this case, a recovery plan. So it focuses on the stakeholder experience and the interactive relationships that allow for more active involvement of key stakeholders than we would traditionally see in decision-making processes or policy planning, with a view to reaching a mutually valued outcome. It blends the ideas of those stakeholders to create new ideas, exploring both the existing challenges and the potential solutions. And by giving centre stage to those stakeholders, and I should reiterate, these stakeholders are, they're kind of, this is, I'm talking about a broad range of stakeholders. It is everything from key government officials through to members of our communities. And by giving centre stage to them in that design and implementation practice, we then also gain really valuable information about how those participants both experience the issue itself and also the potential solutions to those issues. So ultimately what you're talking about is creating a plan or a strategy that's robust, it's meaningful, it's fit for use both now and into the future. I haven't got time to talk to you about specific methods. There are a huge range of methods that can be used, including citizens' assemblies. But what I would just very quickly say that generally what's at the core of a good co-creation process is this notion of design thinking. And design thinking focuses on human beings from the outset. So instead of viewing these problems solely from an organization's resource perspective or a system perspective, we view them through an experience perspective. So how is the problem perceived or experienced by the stakeholders? And by creating empathy with the stakeholders, design thinking then reframes the challenge in a way that enables those participants to contribute to really effective and shared solutions. It's not an easy process, it's time consuming. You really need to ensure that you've got the right people leading it and that you give it the time and the resources that are required. But done properly, one, the resultant actions are targeted, they're effective, they're realistic, and they're deemed feasible, which is really crucial. And two, really importantly, that the correct processes and relationships are in place to continually review that plan and to ensure that it remains fit for purpose. And then finally, I just want to talk to you about the kind of the other side effect of co-creation, which I really love this bit, and it's the soft outcomes that are harder to measure and evidence, but equally important, and certainly something I've seen in all my experience of delivering co-creation processes. So using this kind of active participation to effectively engage people not only increases the understanding of the issue and its complexity, which is really key to then developing effective solutions, but it also builds relationships, it builds trust. And in a community like Oxford, and then if we scale that up nationally, even globally, that's really crucial and shouldn't be dismissed. You know, we are at an unprecedented time. We are facing an emergency and nobody can address it on their own. We really, really now more than ever need to pull together. So just to finish off and to sum up, what I would say is a green recovery plan that arises from one of these kind of co-creation processes is more likely to succeed because essentially the value is more evident to the participants, and therefore the solutions created are more realistic, more effective, more robust, and really importantly stand a much better chance of being successfully implemented. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anna. That's obviously like speaking from so much experience, and it's really great to have that on the panel today. And from a similar but also quite different background, we have Simran, who's going to share about her work with CDP and working at multiple levels of government, I believe. So looking forward to hearing what you have to say, Simran.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak today. And thank you so much for all the other panelists. I just agree with pretty much everything that's been said today. So it's really great to be on this panel. Just a little bit about me quickly and what CDP is. So CDP used to stand for the Carbon Disclosure Project. And what we do is we're a global disclosure platform where over 800 cities, 8,000 companies, and 120 states and regions disclose their climate data to us on an annual basis. And I work to support local authorities in the UK to disclose their climate-related data to ensure that local authorities are being transparent about their climate actions that they're taking and the progress that they've made on their targets. But for the purposes of today and building back better, I think a green and just recovery is, as we've all said, is definitely needed to better address the immediate challenges of the pandemic, but then also to tackle the immediate and longer term challenges of the climate breakdown. COVID-19 has also identified parts of the population that are more disproportionately affected by the pandemic. So it's really great that, Charlie, you have so much analysis to show which parts of Oxford East actually are identified and really heavily impacted. So by choosing a green and just recovery, we can actually hopefully create an inclusive economy that actually works for all of those workers and addresses actually the environmental and social injustices that are kind of at the heart of what we're doing. Recently, CDP actually did some analysis that showed that cities who were reporting co-benefits of their climate actions were actually reporting 2.5 times more actions than cities that weren't. So if they're reporting climate actions that actually identify co-benefits, which are benefits that aren't just emissions reductions, they were actually doing more action. And why we think this is actually really important is because it shows that they were planning climate action that also delivers co-benefits to other stakeholders. It gets to bolster support from other people within the city. It mobilizes more scarce resources across city departments, and it also maximizes more opportunities to address multiple social, economic, and environmental challenges at the same time. So when action is taken that is more holistic and inclusive, we've actually seen, and the evidence shows from our data, that more cities will deliver. So there's a few kind of overall themes though that we would love to see addressed, and some of them have been touched on, so I'll go a bit faster through those. But that the recovery should not be a return to business as usual. The world was on track for 3 degrees or higher, so we need to be aiming for 1.5 or net zero. So therefore, we just can't. The scientific evidence shows us that we cannot go back to normal. And we would really encourage local authorities to set emissions reduction targets that are actually in line with this science. Then secondly, that the recovery must address issues of equity, that we've been able to identify through the pandemic who the key workers were, who's lost jobs, who's been taken ill by COVID, and policies that are put in place to actually support those parts of the population. And many local councils have conducted this analysis, but actually it needs to be used to inform the decision making, not just shown as an exercise that it was done. Thirdly, that the recovery must improve the resiliency of our cities and communities. Investment needs to be made to protect against future threats as well, including the climate crisis, to support people impacted by both climate and health risks. And this will require cities to actually conduct risk and vulnerability assessments to measure against this. And then lastly, that local authorities will actually need to collaborate with the private sector to deliver meaningful actions. Many local councils only control about 2 to 4% of the emissions within their boundary. Therefore, they will actually need to collaborate with the companies, the organizations, the institutions that are within their boundary to help them meet their target. Recently, through COVID, more than 200 leading businesses such as BT, ASDA, have all calling the government to call for a green and just recovery as well. So we know that there are some businesses that are actually in support of these types of measures. Then in terms of a bit more like practical actions, we really have seen some best practice around kind of 3 categories. Job creation and inclusive economy, that resilience and equity is at play, and that health and well-being is at the heart of it. So in terms of job creation, we're really seeing local councils looking into investing in building retrofit programs, which can create jobs, but also inject money into local supply chains. There's also been an increased interest in investing in renewable energy generation, and several councils like Bristol have actually been investing in renewables, and this actually was a source of income throughout the pandemic. So it showed actual results by doing this earlier on. In terms of resilience, we'll need to be looking at local food supplies to ensure that people actually have access to healthy food. Other measures in terms of equity is putting measures in place to protect tenants, homeowners, homeless people, as people's job security and income have really been impacted. In terms of health and well-being, I think this has been done really well, to be honest, through COVID, that there have been more measures to put in place to protect cyclists and pedestrians, and those really need to continue. They can't just be pop-up measures, but actually have to be long-term sustainable investments that we keep, because people have really seen the benefits of them. They're just a few examples of some actions that we can be taking and prioritizing. Because one thing that's for certain is that we can't go back to business as usual, that the climate emergency will still be there to address. And local authorities really need to be learning from each other to share best practice, to share the challenges that they faced, and to collaborate with each other, because it's not super unique what everyone's going to have to do. They can actually really learn from each other and replicate some of the actions that are taking. So it's a real opportunity to actually address both challenges of the pandemic and the climate crisis, to build a new normal that actually works for people and planet.
Thank you, Simran. It's so great to hear about the collaborative processes, and I really hope that in a lot of ways that's kind of what we're hoping to kickstart here in Oxford, in the community as well. At this point, I'm handing back over to Matt, who's got lots more questions for all of you. Yeah, I'll stop now and let him take over.
Thanks, Karina. Got one for Anna firstly, which is, it's a slightly long one, but I'll read through it. So it's co-creation often talks about reaching out to wider stakeholders, which is really great, but it's often really hard to reach some of the most impacted groups, stakeholders like the AME communities, working class, homeless people. Anna, are you able to provide any tangible examples or steps that can be actively taken to make sure these people can be consulted and reached?
Very good question, very valid. You're right, it's incredibly hard. Very briefly at the outset of a process, if I was leading a process, we do what we call a stakeholder mapping exercise, where we are mapping out the groups of stakeholders and then breaking that down to individuals. Particular examples that I've really needed to ensure that we're reaching out to the often lesser heard communities. Often the best route in, particularly given we're very often limited resources, is through charities and support groups and local organisations to get us to those people, or at least get us to the representatives of those people. I would say, slightly off on a tangent, but linked is, that's quite a common question we get asked. How do you reach the hard to reach in these processes? And I would just flag, actually, we very often make an assumption about who those hard to reach are, and that we need to be accessing them. But I like to remind myself and others, in terms of addressing the climate crisis, they're not actually the groups that we need to be reaching as a priority. We need to be reaching the very small percentage of individuals and organisations that are the biggest polluters, the frequent flyers, those with a very high carbon footprint, the kind of typical working class communities. I can see the question now in the chat. The homeless, the BAME communities have an incredibly small footprint, you know. So I'm just throwing that in as something else to think about. Absolutely, their voices need to be heard. Of course they do, and they are primarily, though, because they are going to be the most hit by climate change typically, and by things like COVID, not because we need them to reduce their carbon footprint as much as we do others.
If you don't mind if I can chime in there.
Jump in on that.
Yeah, I completely agree that, you know, communities of BAME communities are not the highest emitters. So definitely when it's consulting them, it's on a different sort of basis. But there are some great examples of how some local authorities have structured themselves. So for example, Bristol City Council have really kind of changed their governance structure to be more inclusive, to be looking at climate through many different lenses. So not just climate, but through health, well-being, environment, through housing. They have like 8 or something like that, priority areas that they've done. And then on top of that, they've engaged different stakeholders as part of those groups. Then they've also supported and created Black and Green Ambassadors. That's like a mentorship program to have community leaders and really foster themselves, to empower themselves to actually speak up, as opposed to just someone else coming in. So how do you actually empower those communities to speak up for themselves, create leadership within those communities for them to feel more confident to engage? And another way for that to really happen is also through faith-based groups. I think sometimes we don't feel comfortable engaging in that space, or at least the climate space doesn't always feel that comfortable doing that. But actually, that's actually a community and area that most BAME communities regularly engage with. So to get to them, actually, it is going through different avenues that may not be something you as a person, you yourself may not engage in.
It's really interesting, thank you. Just put another question to you, Simran. It's by Christina, who says, what motivation is there for the 1% who have the greatest wealth to change their economic activities, as they have enormous wealth to survive what is to come?
Definitely. I think for the 1%, it will be stranded assets. A lot of the stuff that they have won't be valuable in like 5-10 years. All the cars, all the houses, any stock that they have in any fossil intensive industries just won't be valuable anymore. So it's actually, we've seen huge investors starting to change what they're investing in. We've seen trends in investment in fossil fuel industries generally going down. So actually those 1%, if they are really smart and strategic, won't be holding on to fossil intensive investments anymore, because it will just not benefit them in the future.
Thank you.
Can I add in there very quickly that books like The Spirit Level show that actually you improve quality of life for everyone if you reduce the sort of wealth inequality or income inequality. So whether you, like in countries like Japan that have a sort of socially cultural sort of cap on income, or more sort of Scandinavian countries that do distribution of wealth better, you actually get a better quality of life for everybody in that scenario, because you have more trust in society, you have more community, you have people coming together more. So I think that argument actually should work for the 1% sort of as well.
Just on the points that Anna was raising earlier, Charlie, I saw you nodding along, talking about design thinking, citizens' assemblies, co-creation. Is that a model that Build Back Better very much embraced?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think design thinking is the 21st century thinking. Really, I spent a little bit of time in Stanford, where design thinking was created, and a little bit of time in tech companies, where the best tech companies are design-led. So it's all about thinking about it from the user's perspective and building systems and processes that way around. It's sort of, no matter what you're talking about, it's just a better way of designing products and services. And so what's really important is then, who is the user? So you've got to get a representation of society in this process. That's really important, so that it works for everybody. But I'd say, if you haven't heard of design thinking, if you don't know what design thinking is, go and look it up, Google it, YouTube it, really absorb yourself in what design thinking is, because I really think it's the way that we do things better in the future.
And I suppose just finally, going back to you, Anna, is there any advice you give to people in Oxford who are looking to kind of pressure local politicians and to kind of create change locally in terms of how to design their campaigns and kind of work for change?
I think the primary thing that strikes me after today is the relationship you've got with Annalise, and having a way in is just such a monumentally huge first step, because from what she's saying, she's open to conversations, and that is really important. I think in addition to that, really ensuring those voices from across Oxford East are being heard through linking up with different groups, collaboration all the way.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for that discussion, and for everyone for putting in the questions, and go back to Karina to conclude.
Yeah. Thanks for answering these questions, everyone, and thank you all for sticking around for an hour and 15 minutes. We're pretty much on time, which is amazing. And yeah, it's been a really, really interesting discussion. Obviously, it could go on much longer, but it's been really great to start this conversation and to allow constituents to engage with Annalise and with all of your expertise in this area, and I'm really hoping that those people who have attended are feeling empowered to reach out into their communities, to find other people to work with on this, to reach out to Annalise and to potentially other MPs in the area or across the UK. So yeah, please do get in touch with Hope for the Future if you would like more support with talking to Annalise or any other MPs about climate change. And also, yeah, do please fill in the feedback form, which will come up when we exit the session. So yeah, finally, just yeah, thanks again to all of you very much for coming, and yeah, have a lovely afternoon, everyone. Bye.